Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to dive right into our next presentation by Nick Connizzo, who will talk about the Council of State Archivists Prepare project. Nick, if you want to take it away.
Nick, I think you're muted, unfortunately.
Oh, thank you. Nope, that was better. Hopefully this is better now. Appreciate it. What's the presentation without a few technical errors? All right, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. My name is Nick Connizzo. I'm a project manager and consultant for the State Electronic Records Initiative and the Council of State Archivists. I will be talking about preparing archives for records and email, our project under the EABCC grant. So I'm also going to put into the chat here a link. Hopefully I will be able to do this correctly. Maybe I'll put it later in the chat. I want to put a link to our website. We have pretty much all of our resources located there on the Council of State Archivists Prepare webpage. So I'm going to be referencing some of them today, so you may want to follow along or just download and read them later. There's quite a bit of content there, from the reports of the different phases of the project to our best practices documents to our guidance documents that we prepared towards the end of it. All right, perfect. Thank you, Ruby. All right, so let us talk about Prepare. So I'm going to start by talking about the Council of State Archivists a little bit. It's a nonprofit membership organization of the 50 states, 5 territories, and District of Columbia archives. So it's been around for about 20 years in various incarnations, and works to foster a collaborative community among state and territorial archives and archivists, and beyond, including IT agencies, records management professionals, records producers, and pretty much everybody in government who has a role in the management of records, especially electronic records, through the State Electronic Records Initiative series. There's a couple other projects that CoSA does. I would encourage you all to check them out as well. As you'll hear today, the work related to email preservation and management in government is not complete. We didn't solve it, but we will be continuing to work on this over the next 5, 10, 20 years, as long as email is being used, and probably for a considerable amount of time after that. Myself, I'm a digital archivist at Norwich University here in Northville, Vermont. I'm also a project manager for the Backer project and the Prepare project for the Council of State Archivists. I put my contact information here. You can feel free to reach out to me at any time about this or other work that we've done, specifically related to email or digital preservation in state government. And before I start, or maybe shortly after I start, I wanted to thank everybody that was involved in this project. Obviously, Chris and Ruby and Eden and other folks from the University of Illinois and the Mellon Foundation, of course, and then the many, many, many people who consulted on our project, Prepare. We had a professional advisory group of digital curation, digital humanities, digital preservation experts from around the US. We had a professional focus group of digital archivists from the state and territorial archives. Many, many hours spent by volunteers in the State Electronic Records Initiative reviewing our work, providing comments and helping us on our drafts, and obviously the many other reviewers, consultants, and volunteers. I scrolled through the attendee list and I saw that many of you are here today. So thank you so much for all your help with this. We really embrace the community building aspect of this, and none of this work was done by any one person alone. This is a kind of collaborative effort of the 50 states and 5 territories in DC. So we hope that what we've come up with today is a good foundation for the future, because like I said, it's not really solved. So I'm going to give a brief background and overview, kind of set the stage for just kind of the situation, the problem, as I will get into. And then I will talk about the project itself, which was really conducted over 3 phases: needs assessment, testing, tools and protocols, and then direct and indirect assistance. I'm going to focus more on phase 1 and phase 2. I'll plug that at 11 Central tomorrow. I'm giving a presentation with Lisa Erickson Harris from the state of Maine. We'll be talking about the direct assistance project we have with them in great depth. So I encourage you all to attend that tomorrow if you want to see how this kind of shook out in practice and still is ongoing. So I'll really be focusing on the first 2, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. There's a lot of information that we covered both in the presentation and we'll be covering, and we did cover in the report. So I'm hoping that there will be some questions that we can address about the various different aspects of email management in government. So I want to start with just a background and kind of problem statement, just talk about email generally. So our keynote speaker today had some great comments about public records generally. And I know that, public records, unlike many of our archival collections, they have very, very specific and strict requirements, both for accessing them. So, whatever audience you're part of and whatever point in the life cycle that you wish to access the records, there are provisions in state and territorial law to provide access to them, such as Freedom of Information Act. In some states, it's called Freedom of Access or Public Records Act or things like that. In addition to those access requirements, which are pretty strict, there are also protection. That's kind of the other side of the coin. And those protection requirements typically take the form of exemptions to that public records access. And those are found in statute, case law, policy, procedure, et cetera. And those have to be applied throughout the life cycle as well. And I'm going to talk a lot about the records life cycle today because a lot of our talk is about, and a lot of our work was about governance in addition to technology. And that's a little sneak preview for later. But because of those requirements, we are constantly thinking about those in the back of our mind when we talk about how to manage and preserve and provide access to email. We can't, it's not to say that archivists can, but in general, we have to be very, very careful about making sure that all of our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted and that we know everything that's contained within the records at all times. And when we're talking about the scale of public records, especially email, we're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of messages coming to the archives theoretically each year. And so I think one of the presenters on the EPAD presentation said it previously, we're not going to review every single message. It's not really possible just from a process perspective. So we need to be looking at the sets of records broadly. And yeah, we don't have the resources to be able to do it. More is spent on email applications, management, the contracts, the licenses, than is spent on archives total in state government. And we're talking about many magnitudes more spent on the technology. So we have a pretty big mandate to collect, select, collect, transfer, preserve, and make accessible public records that are in email format, yet we don't really have a ton of resources to do so. And like I said, we don't have the resources certainly to read and review every message. That would take an incredible amount of time. And of course, we know email generally is, and we have a picture of the beast here, it's a kind of a challenging thing in government. It's not necessarily challenging technologically. It's a fairly simple standard internet message format, but there's been many implementations over the years. We're talking about at least 30 years of legacy email that many states have. Some have never deleted email since the 90s. Others have, really, really extensive different sets of collections that kind of trace the development of the technology since the 90s or the 80s. In addition to the different platforms and technologies involved, there's been as many, if not twice as many, governance models over the years. And that's not just in terms of who runs the email servers or who's responsible for managing records, but also just what formats, what technology is used, where it's located, and so on. But the biggest kind of downfall of email in state and territorial government is just how it's been used. And if you can imagine a way that email has been used in government, it probably has been. Anything from collecting public health statistics or individual case files for Medicaid or Medicare to permits and licenses for environmental conservation or land usage, all the way down to constituent correspondence. There's all different types of ways that email has been used. Many of them I wouldn't recommend in the future or in the past, but some of them have been used in that way. And others are totally appropriate and totally necessary. And part of the ubiquity of email and the ease of use of the technology meant that it was applied in probably many ways that it shouldn't have been. So because of that, we've got just a ton of legacy email in addition to the ever-growing set of current email that we have for all the state and territorial employees. So it's a big problem in government, and it's not getting any smaller. In fact, it continues to grow. And I mentioned a couple times the records lifecycle, and I'm not going to go too deep on this, but I think it is really important for the context of this conversation. When we talk about email management and preservation, those requirements are for the entire enterprise of government. They're not just what happens at the archives. And in many ways, the biggest challenges with email preservation is just getting it to the archives. So in general, I don't want to, I'm really dumbing this down a lot, but in general, the way that most public records are governed is with this record's kind of life cycle in mind. You have a set kind of a governing document, such as a record schedule or similar instrument that determines how long a record needs to be retained and what the various different, parts of its life cycle are. In general, we're looking at legal requirements. We're looking at procedural operational requirements. We're looking at public access requirements, and we're looking at those at the various different phases of its life. Your active phase, that's when it's in use. Your inactive phase, that's when it's no longer in use, but it needs to be retained to meet those legal requirements or for referential reasons or whatever it might be. And then there's usually a disposition decision that is made, whether to retain it permanently as an archival record or to destroy it. The trouble with email is that it doesn't quite fit into this life cycle model that easily. This works really great when we're talking about unstructured documents, and especially paper records, which is when many record schedules were developed. Obviously, many of them in many states have been updated since to accommodate digital records. But when we're thinking about email, it's not really the same. It's not a like for like, and everybody who's on this webinar probably understands that email versus a traditional set of digital records is very, very different. And part of the reason is that, especially in the state and territorial kind of context, these records are managed individually. End users, so the individual state and territorial employees, whether it's the secretary of the agency or an elected official like your secretary of state or your governor, all the way down to kind of the lowest of the kind of low-level operational staff member, they very likely have their own email account, and they're very likely managing it themselves. They may have an administrative assistant who's managing it for them, but most of the time they're managing it themselves, as opposed to most other public records, which are managed collectively as part of a SharePoint site or content management system or case management system or something like that. So there's not a lot of windows for archivists and records managers into those accounts and those records. Public employees also not exactly afforded the time to organize their email, don't necessarily have the appropriate training to do so in a way that makes sense for access purposes, may not have the expectations that they are required to do so or that they need to do so. And frankly, most employees probably don't want to, or probably don't derive a lot of value from organizing their email in that way, because again, for most of the email lifecycle, it's kind of just to receive, synthesize the information, and then move on. So there's not a lot of value for the average employee to do so. And finally, one other confounding factor is that the way that the email technology is distributed throughout government is that most agencies don't manage their own email. Typically, typically you see this type of model where there is an enterprise-wide IT agency that works with a vendor. So most commonly in state and territorial government, we're talking about Microsoft Exchange or Google Cloud. And then you have other agencies which have clients who are part of this, kind of connect to this server. Of course, this is not the only model, and this is the model that is most prevalent today. It was not always like this. When email applications were first being proliferated kind of across state and territorial government, they started out at individual agencies, which at the time often had their own IT departments, and that kind of slowly moved into this enterprise-wide model that we see commonly in most states today. There are some legacy examples of that individual agency IT management. That's probably most common when we're looking outside of the executive branch, such as your judicial agencies or your legislative branch. That's not often included in this. So we certainly are thinking about that as depending on the state, may be considered to be public records or not. But we are thinking about not just this model today, but also the way that it has looked over the last 20, 30 plus years. So finally, I just want to give you the archival perspective of this. At the outset of the project, which started in 2021, a third of the states and territories essentially had never collected email in any formal way. This is exempting those kind of one-offs where they accessioned a hard drive or a disk that had some email on it, but it was never collected in a methodical or kind of specific way. Of those that did, so we're talking fewer than 10 here, fewer than 10 states and territories totally, they didn't have a lot of experience doing so. They either didn't have a formal program or hadn't been doing it for very long. And those that did, and those that do have email records, most of them aren't using their digital repositories, which many of them do have, to actually preserve and provide access to these records. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, which we'll get into. But I think the ultimate question that we were asking as part of Prepare is, are these questions of governance or are these questions of technology? We're talking about a huge amount of data that is being created every year and being stored every year. We're also talking about a bunch of different public agencies who really need to work together, but kind of don't do so enough, especially when it comes to the management of email. You've got an IT agency, you've got a records producing agency, you may have a legal agency such as your attorney generals or assistant attorney generals, or those type of counsel. You may have an administrative agency that is part of the process. And then of course you have records management and the archives as well. So you're really talking about, potentially 5 or 6 different agencies who have a role in the management of email, all dealing kind of with the same or maybe even different technologies. So I think you probably can see where this is going, but that's the general question that we're going to be asking as part of Prepare. So we designed the project, I'm going way too far. We designed the project to have pretty much 5 specific outcomes. I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but really we started with a needs assessment, which was to survey the different state and territorial archives to see what their greatest obstacles were, what their greatest challenges were, what their capacities were. Then we wanted to work on the development of best practices, and that's not kind of creating things out of whole cloth. We look to kind of the best examples that we found around the US among the more mature state archives, and try to simplify, extend, and synthesize their information into documents that everybody could use. Then there was a testing phase where we had the aforementioned focus group of expert digital archivists, and then we had the technical assistance and mentoring phase, which that's kind of the latter part of the project where we were deployed directly to collaborative projects with the states and territories, with the idea of just being in there kind of on the ground, seeing what the issues were. So that was incredibly valuable for us and hopefully the states as well. And lastly, it's the ongoing deepening of the communities of practice around email management and preservation. A big part of this project, as I mentioned, was kind of embracing that element and really working together. Nothing here was done by kind of a single archivist. Really, everything had a whole bunch of ideas and different hands in its construction. So we think that this rising tide, especially across the archival community, will really raise everybody's capacity. So that's kind of the goal here. So to break down these phases, our phase 1 was the needs assessment. Phase 2 was the application tools and protocol assessing, and phase 3 was the technical assistance and mentoring. And even though the grant period is over, I can happily report that a bunch of these projects are still ongoing. They've been very valuable for the individual states, and the foundations that we built have kind of continued to inform their practice and their capacity. So I'm going to talk about the needs assessment survey first. This happened at the beginning of 2021. So it was distributed in the spring and completed with results by the summer. So in order to put this together, the project had both a project manager, that was me, and a project coordinator, Michelle Gallinger, who was responsible for kind of doing the community coordination elements of this. This is a list of the members of our advisory group. So I saw some of you are on the call today, so I'll thank you again for your participation. We had a bunch of sit downs with them collectively and many of them individually to both design our project and design our survey and get feedback on the results. We really wanted to take a lot of perspectives on what we should be asking, because we wanted to really start with kind of a blank slate. And so these members of the advisory group were extremely helpful to us. So again, I can't really thank them enough. The survey itself was pretty simple. It was a few dozen questions that was distributed to each of the 56 member archives, basically to determine what their preservation and processing capability were for email. We asked them to look across the entire enterprise, not just as their own internal capabilities. So we really were trying to evaluate evaluate the state's capacity and the territory's maturity, not just the archives. And these are a couple of the key elements that we asked about, though there were many, many more. I think it ended up being 50 some odd questions, and they're all different areas. We have a report for phase 1 that's on our website, the Prepare website. Please feel free to download, read it. It has a lot of the insights that you might find valuable, maybe informative to you as well. So it was a very successful survey. We had a 90% plus response rate. So over the course of several months, they were able to respond. We had some office hours where the individual member archives could talk to us, detail the questions. And as I said, we produced a report that you can find and be able to see our findings. One of them that was I always thought was kind of interesting was kind of the wide distribution of who's in charge of the state email systems. We were looking at trying to figure out who we should be collaborating with. And as you can see, it's kind of the kitchen sink. It's kind of everybody. So that's good to know. And you'll see that theme kind of throughout this presentation and throughout the project, is that there is no one size fits all process or workflow or governance document that works. Every state and territory does it differently. Some of them devote a ton of resources to it. Some of them devote almost nothing to it. So it's really hard to come up with a single piece of best practice, a best practice that would be really applicable to both New Hampshire and California, or would be applicable to both Puerto Rico and Indiana. So it really depends on the individual audience. That's kind of why we went with the direct assistance. But in general, we were happy with the responses that we got. Some of the good information that we received, and I mean good as in this is very encouraging, was that most states have the necessary legal foundations to preserve email appropriately. This is kind of a two-sided coin, because I say they should have it. They have the necessary statutes, they have the necessary policies, they have the necessary record schedules, but it's not happening. As you saw in 90%, so that's 47 some odd respondents or so, but really only 2/3 of them are actually getting email. So that's the first gap that we identified. Why, if the policy is good and the law is good, why aren't the records getting to the archives? The second one that was very encouraging to us is that, in the absence of good governance, the archives and records management programs, we're talking about 25% of each. And just for some context, not every state has the archives and the records management combined into a single agency. So we didn't survey records management agencies specifically. We surveyed the state archives or the territorial archives. So there is a bit of a difference there. So we did kind of break those out as different demographics, but they publish their own email governance requirements. Most of them are quite simple, such as here's file formats you should use, here's who's responsible for making a transfer, here's how to identify potentially redact sensitive information, a really important topic we'll talk about later. But we're really encouraged that there's some governance out there. And of course, there's tons of desire to collaborate more among all those constituent professionals that I mentioned before that have email governance related roles. This one, I thought it was another piece of information that was kind of tickling, is that when we start to look at who's transferring records to the archives, again, even more of a kitchen sink, they kind of come from everywhere. So when publishing our guidance and working on our best practices, we've had to keep in mind that we can't write just a technical document focused towards IT, because there might be an AG's office that needs to understand how to do it. There might be a vendor that uses a very specific type of software that might need to know what to do. So we need to keep our audiences in mind, and we wanted to figure out who's really involved. But that kind of segues us into, because there are so many people involved, what's kind of the bad part of this. One is that 58% of our archives basically had nothing in terms of governance, in terms of requirements, whether it's transfer or preservation or metadata or whatever it might be related to email specifically. And again, we have kind of called out email as a kind of special and discrete type of record that is found in government. So kind of challenging to transfer the email when there's not a lot of policy related to it. Fewer than half of our respondents at the time, this is 2021, had a digital preservation system that was up and running. So even if they could get the email to them, they really couldn't preserve it in the way they needed to. And the last one was kind of the most stark example of where capacity needed to be raised, was that only about 3 or 4 of the respondents, so I think it was 3, ever used any of the software we're going to be talking about, and some of which you've heard about today already, related to process or manage email. Part of that is because they just aren't getting the email, but the second part of it is there's just so much lack of experience and expertise that we really need to know what they should be using, why they should be using it, when they should be using it, what they should be using it for. And then lastly, we have the obstacles that remain. It's one thing to be able to identify the problem, but we also wanted to find out from the state and territorial archivists what the biggest problems were. And as probably a surprise to no one, the biggest one is scale. I think we surveyed both how much they have today, so the current size of their collections, but also how much the state and territorial archives expected their collections to grow, and it ended up being 1.5 million messages over the next 5 years on average, resulting in many hundreds of gigabytes or multiple terabytes of data. Obviously, again, we're not looking individually at every single record at this point, so this is a huge obstacle to them. And one of the things we looked at when we went into our tools and protocols testing was scalability. But then other ones, as you can imagine, insufficient statewide policy adoption was another one. That's a tough one for us to deal with because, as you might imagine, the state archives is for pretty much every state. We're not an enforcement agency. We can create policies, but we don't have really the ability to monitor compliance, to sanction or do anything to agencies that don't comply. That's not really our role anyway. So it's one thing to promulgate a policy, it's another thing to make sure that it's being actually adopted and used. And one of the common refrains we heard was, yeah, there's an email policy, but nobody does it, right? There's a way that you're supposed to organize your inbox, but nobody does it. And yeah, that's a problem of records management and a problem of training, but it's also a problem for us because the email just doesn't get to us because of that. Or when it does, we are obligated to do so much more to process it than we really should have to do. That's kind of going to be a recurring issue. So in order to address these obstacles and these questions, we convened our focus group for phase 2, which was the tools and protocols testing. Our objectives during this phase were pretty straightforward. We're not looking to, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of these tools very, very briefly. Some of them are other EABCC awardees, and I would strongly recommend using any and all of them. They all are incredibly useful in the right context. That was really where we were focused. We're not looking at the efficacy or how good or bad these tools are. We wanted to provide the opportunity to just get some experience with them. We also didn't want to assume, again, we know there's no one size fits all approach to this. So we didn't want to assume any type of operating system, any type of technical expertise, any type of email processing experience or expertise. We wanted to, because we're trying to build the capacity at every state and territorial archives. And as we know, a third of them have literally done nothing with any email ever. So we need to kind of start with no knowledge and no information as our baseline. We wanted to enhance support and refine existing workflows. So we did create a simple workflow for email processing that the testers could use, especially for those who didn't have one of their own. But we also encourage them to use, if their archives had one, any electronic records processing workflows or tools or reporting applications or things like that that they might normally use. Again, we're trying to evaluate the efficacy of putting these tools in context, not kind of them standalone. And then lastly, of course, we wanted to get everybody experience working with email sets. One of the big obstacles for most states and territories is that they just don't have email to work with. It's hard to kind of build a test collection of public records that may or may not have sensitive and protected information that needs to be secured, and share it widely and disseminate it widely. So that was kind of a challenge for us, but we fortunately have a solution there. So we had a great group of testers from kind of all around the US, both on the records management and the digital archive side of things. And over the course of a 12-week testing period, they were able to kind of get in there and test our workflow, the tools specifically, and really just kind of dig around and poke at the edges of everything related to email processing. So the way we did this was we created 2 virtual machines, so 2 VMs. One was Ubuntu Linux based and one was Windows based, on which we installed a bunch of different software, which I'll get to in a second, saying, here's some things you could use whichever ones you're interested in, and use whichever ones work best for you. We were given, very, very fortunately, and again, thank you to the state of Utah, I can't thank you enough, for the use of a sample data set, a pre-processed but still incredibly valuable collection of over 14,000 emails in EML format with their associated attachments. So PDFs, Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, etc., that were associated, that were organized hierarchically, mirroring the look of somebody's inbox. So the inbox and multiple different folders, and then just a kind of a general collection. But we also encouraged the states and territories to use their own emails as well. So we knew many of them had legacy collections that had not yet been processed and not yet made available to the public. So we wanted to make sure that they could use either one. It ended up being about 50-50. So about half of the group used their own and about half started with the sample data. But I think pretty much everybody touched the sample data at one point because it was just very extensive. It had, I think it was over 7 gigabytes, and like I said, it was over 14,000 individual messages. And we used data sets that were anywhere as small as 3 megs, all the way up to about 4.5 gigs in terms of our testing data. We also created, using Emailchemy, something which has been mentioned at the symposium before, and some other tools, Thunderbird, some Outlook extensions. We created our own mBoxes too from this sample data set, and helped the testers use those as well. Though there were some issues with that, which I'll get to in a minute. But we wanted to provide just kind of like a scattershot approach, give everybody as much as they possibly could want, and let them figure it out. We provided, as I mentioned, kind of a sample framework for them to use. So this is just a look at what our VM looked like. We were able to distribute this and then kind of distribute the email separately. So we looked at EPAD and Darkmail and Tomes and Libratum, which is from the State Archives of North Carolina. We looked at Emailchemy, Mozilla Thunderbird, various Outlook plugins, and then others were encouraged to install and use whatever products they wanted. So someone wanted to have an Access database. Someone wanted a couple other different kind of commercial software that they used in their state. So of course that was allowed. We provided them a simple workflow. I'll point you to the phase 2 report again on our website if you want to see what that workflow was, but it was really straightforward. Collect the messages, process the messages, search for sensitive or protected information. What's your outputs look like? What do your reporting look like? What does your audit trail look like? What does your metadata look like, etc. They gave us 12 weeks, 2 hours per week. So all in all, it wasn't as much time. And we said specifically, it was learn as you go. We provided all of the documentation for all the tools that were provided by the vendors or the developers. And I provided office hours. It was 2 days a week in order to just sit with the testers to ensure that any issues they had in terms of installing or configuring the VM, adding more space, importing records, and any processing problems they might have. So I want to just shout out to all of these different tools, some of whom developers are here today. This project wouldn't have been possible without you either. And I would recommend any and all of these software for use in your email processing workflow, with one caveat, which is just it's incumbent upon the archivist to know exactly how they work and exactly what they're doing. And that would be a recommendation I would make to any digital archivist working with any digital processing software. It's really important for email specifically, and I'll just share one anecdote where we had, myself and another one of the testers used 5 different pieces of software to convert EMLs into mBoxes, and the mBoxes look different from all 5 different pieces of software. And 2 of them didn't work with some of the software that you see up on this page. It would not validate as valid mBoxes. So Is that an issue with this software? No, not necessarily. We identified as the problem as being the Microsoft Outlook random plugins that we found, but don't take anything for granted. That was kind of the major advice that came out of the group. In addition to that, there was a lot of feedback that we got. The VMs themselves, they were kind of a double-edged sword. It was really nice because many states do not allow like Linux-based workstations on their state networks. So we had to deploy Microsoft-based ones, but gave them the opportunity to work in that Linux environment. But on the other hand, there was some difficulty with people not being able to use VMs. They hadn't really worked with them before, and so there was some training and some troubleshooting that needed to be done on that front. Some of the applications were difficult to adapt to the uncommon scenarios, and let me tell you that when it comes to the records of email in state government, they're all uncommon scenarios. Nobody does it exactly the same way, and even within the same agency, department, division, they might do it differently, or they might have sets of records that kind of change over from one scenario to another. One of the hardest ones for us to tackle was kind of the idea of a shared mailbox and there being multiple senders and multiple recipients. Some of the applications were better for that, some were worse, but that's really common in state government. So those are the types of things that we have kept on our list. Again, phase 2 report has all of this information. Scalability, obviously a major concern. We had a lot of issues with the VM itself in terms of kind of the data, but also some of the applications, perhaps it was because they were running in a VM, perhaps I didn't configure them correctly, but they kind of started to slow down or hang when you started talking about collections of 5 gigabytes or more, 6 gigabytes or more, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 messages. And let me tell you again that is going to be very common in state government. I think in one of our direct assistance programs, which you're going to hear about tomorrow, you'll find that they have thousands and thousands of accounts already, and we know that some of them have multiple hundreds of thousands or millions of messages with attachments. So we're talking about accounts that themselves are hundreds of gigabytes large. So those are the types of problems that we need to be thinking about when we talk about this. And then lastly, kind of as I mentioned, we need as much audit data as we can. We need to know what's happening underneath the hood in addition to what's happening in what we can see. So much of the digital archive and digital preservation process is obscured from the end user. So it's really important to know what bits are being changed, when they're being changed, how they're being changed, et cetera, especially in the world of e-discovery, public records, freedom of information. We have to be very careful about exactly what we do to these collections. Like I said, and in terms of conclusions, we need really robust discovery and redaction tools. That's kind of the biggest outstanding question that we have. How are we going to be able to manage the task of finding, redacting or segregating sensitive or protected information? And when I say protected, I mean protected by law against disclosure. Most public agencies don't have a process for this, except one which is a on-demand Freedom of Information Act request. Then I do the search and I do redaction. That's not happening when the entire account is being transferred to the archives. Maybe it should, and that will be a big element that we talk about tomorrow. And obviously, as we talked about, these tools are all great, and we just need to know that, or would encourage the developers to make sure they can handle the scale, because we want to use them. We want to use everything out there because they do provide great functionality that nothing else does. And no commercial product is probably going to, because this is such a niche set of requirements. So I'm mindful of the time and I'm getting into the end. Phase 3, as I said, I'm not going to talk too much about the assistance, mentoring, and community building phase, other than to say that essentially what we did during this part, which was the better part of 2022 and into the beginning of this year, and that work continues today. But essentially we synthesized everything we've gathered, all the information we gathered in phase 1 and phase 2. And then we provided both direct, which was that we had the consultants, so the project manager and coordinator, work with the individual states and territories who were willing to engage in this project. And then we had indirect, which is the publication of those best practices documents, those guidance documents, and just the kind of the reports that we had. It was very important for us to focus on building a community of practice within a single state or territory, in addition to across. So CoSA and Syria already do such a great job of looking across the states, but we also wanted to make sure that people are thinking about this within the state. you know, it's a big project that needs to happen across the entire enterprise, and it's not going to happen if only the archives is working on it. It's not going to happen if only the archives and IT is working on it. You really need to have everybody pointed in the right direction, and something like email management is actually pretty easy to get because almost everybody understands that it's a huge problem because it's costing states money, it's costing territories money and resources to deal with it. As I mentioned, so much is spent on managing and creating records in email. Very, very little comparatively is spent on actually processing it, appraising it, and disposing of most of it, which is not archival in nature. So I could go through these all specifically, but these are the types of things that we focus on when it comes to assistance. We're really looking at the selection of emails. How do we select which emails should come to the archives, which are archival in nature? A big part of that is the kind of the capstone model that was piloted, developed by the National Archives. That looks at top level users and account, like, you know, your secretaries of state, your governors, your agency secretaries. We talk about migration in terms of getting records to the archives. What do they look like? Who's doing it? Processing, who's doing it and when? And then, of course, who's providing access to it? What access is provided? How is it provided? And when it comes to the collaborative work, we're looking at governance, roles and responsibilities across the enterprise, and of course that collaborative project building that we have mentioned so many times as being really crucial to our project. And you'll remember that records lifecycle we started with in the beginning. This is kind of what we're looking at now. It's a little bit more complicated, but really we're looking at, you know, the idea that you know, there's a account of you know, belonging to a user or multiple users, and there is some sort of trigger, usually a separation from service, but there might also be a time-based factor in there, considering that we know a lot of state employees, especially those at the kind of mid-level, tend to be state employees for 30 years. But you can't just wait for 30 years worth of email. You need some sort of governance process there. But you know, the way that the technology works today, there's the ability to have inactive or archived user accounts just kind of in a holding area waiting for them to meet their retention requirements. And then there's some kind of final appraisal that can be done. We want to push as much of that as possible to a capstone or position-based appraisal process and hopefully make it simple. And that's kind of the carrot to all of this, is that we want to make it simple. We want to make it extensible. We want to make it possible for every state to be able to pretty quickly be able to appraise and process most of their email. So we can focus on the valuable stuff that comes to the archive instead of focusing on the 90% of public email accounts that don't really have any long-term archival value. So there's a lot more to work on. Tool-specific workflows are coming down the pipe related to whatever individual tools the archives are using. What type of preservation packages can we expect to be transferred to us, because it's unlikely the archives is going to be responsible for doing the transfer. We'll probably be receiving it and providing input, but really it's going to depend on what IT or the record producers can do. We're looking at that role-based governance for email management. Who's responsible for what things at what times? How much can we ask the records managers to do? How much can we ask the end users to do? How much will they actually do? And then lastly, the elephants in the room, such as there's linked data that is proliferating throughout email now. This is your kind of Microsoft. I'm not sending it as an attachment. I'm sending it as a link. And then how does that look? How does that actually get preserved? And it doesn't. Any type of decontextualized information. So, you know, my email, my comments highlighted in red, but the formatting wasn't saved in HTML, something like that. And then the whole other host of uncommon scenarios. We started by looking at kind of a 90%, so the 90-10 approach, and we're thinking about that 10% later. All right, thank you very much. So if there are questions, I will look into the chat. I know I don't have a lot of time. Okay, I have a couple questions in here, so thank you all for your questions. I think the first one is from Rose. Can I give presentations like this one to agencies about our findings? How we go about requesting that? You've done it. Send me an email and I would be happy to come out and talk to your state, your public agency, whatever it might be at whatever level. We have direct assistance programs that are ongoing, and that's what the State Electronic Records Initiative is for. This is just really the tip of the iceberg, so there's a lot more information here. I encourage you all to read the reports from phase 1, 2, and 3 to kind of get at that. And we really tried to make it digestible for a common audience, not just an archivist, not just a digital preservationist, but also a secretary, an agency commissioner, records management, IT agency, CIO, that type of thing. Aaron asks if we've, oh, I'm sorry. Emmeline asks if we have documentation about our testing. Yeah, we have, what we did at the end of each, at the testing phase was solicit a survey from each of the testers. Not everybody filled it in, though we did hear from individual interviews how they did, but we have some of those. Yeah, I will make a note to make sure that we publish those. We didn't publish those with the initial report, but we will put them on our website. We'll put them in the prepare website so you see that as well. All right, let's see. Aaron asks, how do you get state agencies to buy into and actually think of giving emails to the archives? Wow, good question. If anybody else has the answer to that, I am listening. Well, the truth, we rely on what I think of kind of the carrot and the stick approach. The stick is that a public agency in most jurisdictions, so this is most states and territories, law prevents you from destroying public records without the, inappropriately, which usually means without using a record schedule or without consultation from the state archives, the Public Records Advisory Board, or whatever it might be. There's a bunch of different organizations and states who can authorize the destruction of records. So basically, if you don't play ball, you have to retain your records forever. No agency wants to do that, especially with electronic records, because it costs money. That being said, the cost of digital data storage is going down. So I'm sure this is something that we've seen across not just the government community, but also corporate, academia, et cetera, is that people are very content to just say, oh, I'll just hold on to it forever now. So we have to be providing them more. That's where the carrot comes in. What can we do to provide different types of functionality that your end user, that your IT agency probably isn't going to provide? So we want to be able to provide better redaction tools, more on-demand access. Again, there's an enterprise-wide requirement to make sure that the public has access to public records. If you have them, you have to provide access to them. So you're encouraged probably to destroy them as soon as you can, according to the law. We don't want to go past that, but also you want to give them to the archives if they're archival, so we can carry that burden for you. That's what we do. We provide public access to records to hundreds of thousands of people every year, whereas most agencies probably do maybe a few hundred or a few thousand FOIA requests, certain ones exempted. So yeah, it's a lot of here's how we can help you, here's the burden we can carry for you, but it doesn't always work because we have requirements too. We need to make sure that we're not overburdened and we're not taking on too much work. I mean, again, there's more resources devoted to creating email than probably all of the archives across the United States in terms of state government. So how do you kind of manage that with such a small, really segment of the state workforce? It's not easy. Rose asked, who do we think should be the lead on email archiving? Good question. Certainly the selection needs to come from whoever's developing the record schedules, which is usually the archives. I would say in most jurisdictions of the archives, sometimes there is a committee that does so. That just talks about archival email. I think traditionally the archives has been less involved in the management of non-archival or non-permanent email, but the problem is that it's getting really hard to disentangle those two because of the way that public agencies use email. So, for example, we want to be able to say, well, we know that the secretaries and the commissioners, they have important records that relate to policy development, so we want to save those permanently. They certainly have archival records. But we don't know below that level. It would be easy to say, yeah, everybody at this pay grade or lower probably doesn't have archival records based on their influence in government, but we know that analysts at the Department of Environmental Conservation bring in permits related to land usage, which are permanent records in Vermont, for example, that need to be retained indefinitely. So we can't just say there's no kind of blanket approach that's more broadly. So certainly we need the archivist, the state archivist there. But it's not necessarily something that the archives can just dictate. We're really just a piece of this. It's essential to have your IT there, your records producers there, your AGs, your legal there, your administrators there, because if we're not all in sync, it's just not going to work and it's going to break down. And then you'll see what we see now, which is IT agencies that have 20,000 accounts just sitting there waiting to be processed. All right, I'm getting a notice that it's time for kind of the next announcement, but I'm going to stay on to answer questions. So please, if you have more, please feel free to ask them.
Thank you, Nick. I just wanted to jump in real quick because our next sessions are going to be the workshops. And we want to thank everyone who had an interest in participating in the workshops. Unfortunately, both workshops have already been filled to capacity and they're not going to be accessible through this link. So we apologize for not being able to accommodate more people. People have been contacted if they were a part of the waiting list, and you will receive a notification within the next 10 minutes, just in case somebody doesn't show up. So to keep an eye out on your email, and we hope to see you there. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to share some things.
Well, thank you, Ruby. I think you've shared it all. Again, just very appreciative, Nick. Thank you so much for Prepare Project and your time this afternoon. Great to see the interest in it. And again, thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions that I'll keep answering as long as they keep coming. Tim asks, emails not get created in a vacuum in institutions. How records arrive, i.e. SharePoint export at archives, is a very critical question about how that, any ideas about how that gets handled. Yes, I have a lot of ideas about that, how that gets handled. We assume, and this might be an erroneous assumption, but we assume that the most likely scenario is that the IT agency is going to be transferring entire accounts as PSTs. I think like 85 or 90% of states and territories use Microsoft. So we're talking about Microsoft Exchange most of the time. I think Gmail has their standard export as an mbox, but we assume that most of the time we're going to be dealing with PSTs. So there's going to be a conversion process that's part of it. Obviously, there's an element of e-discovery, the kind of the Microsoft e-discovery there as well. One of the big things that we need to work on, and it's not just the archives, but also just state government generally, is whose responsibility is it to find public records exemptions or the data that is exempt, redact it, or isolate it. It's a big question because generally most states and most sets of records, they're not doing that at the point of records creation when it would be ideal, right? When I send an email, presumably that's a good time for me to know that it has confidential information in it. But if I don't flag it then, I think the EPAD presentation was a really good example that sometimes it's really hard to find sensitive or restricted information because, again, the way that these exemptions are written, they're not necessarily discrete. They're not necessarily concrete. It's like any personal health information. I mean, there are lexicons for kind of finding that, but it's not necessarily so easy, especially when you're talking about sets of records that have nothing to do with that, or that you wouldn't expect to find that in, or maybe that you would, but you don't want to get rid of too much stuff. Again, it's a really difficult balancing act. And I think most archives believe that the proper point for that is the records producer. They're the subject matter expert. They have the best opportunity to be able to identify exemptions, but it takes time, it takes resources to do so. So we want to see some of that happen. E-discovery is a good tool for finding those type of exemptions, but how do you actually label them and kind of incorporate them into your email account management before transferring to the archives? Not so simple. And we certainly don't want to see, and it's not possible to see every archives and digital archivist at the state going through emails one by one. We may be looking at AI-enabled tools. We may be looking at kind of collaborative processes to do so. We may have to start enforcing some sort of models, such as, you know, if it contains a keyword, by design, the email system automatically moves it into a certain folder or flags it with a certain label or whatever it might be. There's a lot of approaches to that. Ishmael says, do you have any experience with NSF formats? And which tools can you recommend for use to conversion for preservation formats for email? That's a Lotus Notes, right? That's an IBM. That's kind of like an oldie. So this is my personal opinion. I don't speak for anyone else. I hate all of the file format converters with a passion. None of them really works in a way that I expect. Many of them accidentally or intentionally strip headers, especially custom headers. So part of the question is what's there to begin with, what's actually in. So I don't personally have any experience with NSF. I do have some experience with some Lotus Notes from back in the day, but really one of the things we are looking for when it comes to the transfer from a record producing agency is the header there? Are the bodies there? And by body, I mean both the text and also any attachments. And and how much context is provided with it as well. And, we feel pretty confident that we can preserve a record bit for bit, but it's the context, I think, that we always lose. So we want to, my personal view is that most of what we're talking about, and I assume for the NSF or the Lotus Notes as well, it's text. So it translates very nicely into like an XML or JSON kind of format. So that might be an easy way. If you're trying to preserve look and feel as well, I don't want to say states don't care about that as much, but part of what we're trying to do is preserve, really, I would say, is focus on the content and not necessarily the form, though of course form is important as well. And I'm actually looking forward to a couple of the other presentations during this conference, which might address that a little better, because the NSF, so Lotus Notes, we know there are states that have it, but there's also emails that are saved in HTML, emails that are saved in text files, emails that are saved in SQL databases, emails that are saved in custom database applications, which have licenses whose licensing servers don't exist anymore, so they're encrypted. There's like all different types of scenarios. And I wish I had a better solution for you, but I would say just look at the raw data and extract what you can. A lot of it is probably going to be noise, and you really want to focus on the critical content, or at least that's what we're doing. But that's kind of a necessity because of the scale we're talking about. Unless there's any other questions, I appreciate the questions, and I appreciate the participation. Thank you to everyone who joined today. And like I said, I'll hope you visit our website. I'll go back to this slide that has my contact information. If you want to take it down, send me a message about this or anything else related to email preservation, digital preservation, governance in state government, territorial government, etc. Happy to talk about it. And we're looking for new perspectives too. We recognize, we're not talking about a problem that's solved. It's evolving. It's going to be different a year from now than it is today. And we're looking for best practices anywhere we can get them. So your input is really valuable too. So thank you. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks again, Nick. We'll take a break here while we get set up for the workshops, and we're going to stop the recording here. And we hope to see many of you back at 4 p.m. Central Time this afternoon for our final session of the day. In the meantime, if you're part of the workshop, hope you enjoy that. If not, please enjoy your break and see you back at 4.